They say silence is confusing, but for a Sigma male, silence is strategy. When he stops reacting, something shifts. Not in him, but in everyone around him. The moment he withdraws his emotional response, the entire dynamic changes. People who once relied on his reactions for validation, control, or reassurance suddenly feel powerless. Manipulators lose their leverage. Drainers lose their access, and those who underestimated him realize they never understood him at all. Because a Sigma doesn't gain control by fighting back. He gains control by refusing to play the game. When he stops reacting, he becomes unreadable, unprovocable, uninfluenced. Others push harder, raise their voices, escalate tension, hoping to pull him back into emotional chaos, but the Sigma simply observes, detached and centered. His silence exposes their desperation. His stillness highlights their instability, and the more they try to control him, the more control he gains, because he is no longer giving them what they crave, his attention, his energy, his emotional involvement. That is when the power shifts entirely in his favor. Before we begin, let me ask you, when someone pushes you, do you react, or do you stay silent and watch them reveal themselves? Comment "no reaction" if you understand this power. And make sure you subscribe to Silent Wise, where we explore the psychology behind stillness, self-control, and the quiet dominance that defines the Sigma mindset. His silence forces people to face their own behavior without his emotional cushioning. A Sigma male understands something few people ever realize. Reactions protect others from seeing themselves clearly. When he responds, comforts, explains, or absorbs the tension, he becomes a buffer, a cushion that prevents people from confronting the impact of their own actions. But when he stops reacting, when he withdraws his emotional presence, when he goes quiet, suddenly there is nothing left for them to hide behind. The air gets heavier, the truth gets louder, the silence becomes a mirror, and people are forced to observe their own behavior, without him softening the blow. His silence doesn't punish them, it reveals them. He knows that most people rely on emotional feedback to avoid accountability. They push, provoke, manipulate, or blame, expecting him to react in predictable ways, explain himself, calm the tension, apologize first, or clean up the emotional mess. But the Sigma eventually realizes that by reacting, he was enabling these dynamics. So he stops. He lets their words stand unchallenged. He lets their tones echo without correction. He lets their actions show exactly who they are, and without his emotional cushion, the impact of their behavior hits them directly. Some become defensive. Some become confused. Some become guilty. But all of them become exposed. What makes his silence so powerful is that it cannot be argued with. It gives them no foothold, no anchor, no emotional target to grab onto. Their usual tactics fail because silence refuses to participate. The manipulator cannot twist his words, the aggressor cannot escalate the conflict, the attention seeker cannot feed off his reaction. His quietness dismantles their strategy without him lifting a finger. Suddenly, they're left standing alone with their behavior, and for the first time, they must face the consequences internally. They must acknowledge the disrespect, the inconsistency, the selfishness, or the emotional chaos they've been projecting. His silence does what confrontation never could. It makes them look inward. And yet the Sigma doesn't choose silence out of cruelty. He chooses it out of clarity. He understands that growth, both his and theirs, cannot happen as long as he keeps absorbing the impact meant for them. By stepping back, he creates a space where truth becomes unavoidable. Some people won't handle it well. Some will lash out. Some will disappear. But the ones who stay, the ones who understand the weight of that silence, are the ones capable of real connection. The ones who say, When a Sigma male stops cushioning the world with his reactions, he forces people to meet their reflection honestly. And in that moment, the balance shifts. Because the only person who remains in control is the one who no longer needs to react. He becomes unpredictable, removing others' ability to manipulate or influence him. The Sigma male knows that the moment he stops reacting, he steps out of the script others expect him to follow. Manipulators rely on predictability. They need emotional buttons to push, predictable triggers to exploit, familiar patterns to manipulate. But when the Sigma goes quiet, when he no longer responds the way he used to, when his energy becomes unreadable, everything changes. Suddenly, he is no longer predictable. He no longer gives the reactions they prepared for. He no longer follows the emotional pathways they depend on. And unpredictability is the one thing no manipulator knows how to handle. It breaks their strategy in half. He understands that influence comes from being ungraspable. If someone can anticipate his anger, they can provoke him. If they can predict his forgiveness, they can use him. If they can count on his explanations, they can guilt-trip him. But when he withdraws his reactions, when he becomes silent, composed, and unreadably calm, he removes every advantage they had. The power dynamic flips instantly. They don't know if he's done, if he's processing, if he's distancing, if he's planning, or if he simply stopped caring. That uncertainty creates pressure, not on him, but on them. The one who can't be read becomes the one who cannot be controlled. This unpredictability is not chaos, it's mastery. The Sigma doesn't react because he realizes reactions give away information. Silence gives nothing. A still mind reveals no weaknesses, no insecurities, no emotional leverage. He becomes the one person they cannot decode, cannot predict, and the more they try to push him back into his old patterns, the more silent and steady he becomes. His composure becomes a wall they cannot climb. They expected him to defend himself, explain himself, justify himself. Instead, he gives them nothing. And nothing is far more frightening than anger. This shift forces others to confront their own intentions. Without emotional feedback, their manipulation loses shape. Without predictable responses, their influence dissolves. People become anxious around him, not because he is aggressive, but because he is unreadable. They can no longer anticipate his next move, and that loss of control exposes their dependence on his reactions. Every attempt to influence him fails because influence requires access and silence closes the door. In this quiet unpredictability, the Sigma gains the highest form of power, autonomy. He is no longer shaped by others' agendas, no longer guided by their emotions, no longer predictable enough to be directed. When he stops reacting, he takes back control of the dynamic entirely. Not by fighting, but by disappearing from the emotional battlefield, and suddenly, the only one with power is the one no one can predict. His lack of reaction exposes who depended on his responses for power. A Sigma male knows that some people don't want connection, they want control. They rely on reactions the way a performer relies on applause. Every argument, every guilt trip, every manipulation tactic depends on one thing: his emotional response. As long as he reacts, they feel powerful. As long as he gets angry, explains himself, defends himself, or tries to fix the situation, they feel in control of the dynamic. But the moment he stops reacting, the illusion collapses. His silence becomes a spotlight, revealing exactly who needed his emotions to sustain their sense of dominance. And when the Sigma withdraws that emotional currency, those people have nothing left to hold on to. He sees it clearly. The ones who crumble, panic, or lash out when he goes quiet are the same ones who depended on his reactions more than they depended on honesty, respect, or communication. His lack of response becomes a test, not one he creates intentionally, but one their own behavior makes unavoidable. The person who once fed off his frustration suddenly loses leverage. The one who relied on his reassurance suddenly feels insecure. The one who manipulated through guilt suddenly finds the strategy useless. The one who pushed his boundaries to provoke a reaction suddenly stands alone with their own emptiness. By not reacting, he forces them to confront how much of their power came from his participation, not their strength. What makes this moment so revealing is how quickly the truth rises to the surface. People who valued the relationship will try to understand his silence. People who respected him will adjust their behavior. But those who depended on his reactions for control will unravel. They will escalate, push harder, raise their voice, or switch tactics. Anything to pull him back into the emotional cycle where they felt superior. And the Sigma watches all of this with calm detachment. Not in judgment, but in understanding. Their behavior under silence exposes everything their behavior under conflict tried to hide. His lack of reaction creates a psychological mirror. They can no longer blame him, argue with him, or distract themselves from their own patterns. They are left alone with the truth of how they operate. For the first time, the dynamic shows who needed whom, and for what. It becomes obvious who relied on instability to control him. It becomes obvious who used emotion as leverage. It becomes obvious who felt powerful only when he was losing composure. And the Sigma doesn't need to call it out. He doesn't need confrontation. His silence says everything. Because when he stops reacting, the people who fall apart expose the one thing they feared most, that their power never came from strength. It came from his participation. The moment he removes it, control returns to its rightful place in his hands, not theirs. He reclaims his energy by refusing to be dragged into emotional battles. A Sigma male eventually learns that not every conflict deserves his presence, and not every emotional storm is his responsibility to weather. For years, he may have reacted out of habit, defending himself, clarifying misunderstandings, calming others, or absorbing tension to keep the peace. But reacting always came with a cost. Every outburst drained him. Every argument stole his focus. Every emotional tug of war pulled him further from the man he was trying to become. So one day he stops, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. He refuses to enter emotional battles where nothing grows, nothing heals, and nothing changes. And the moment he makes that choice, something powerful happens. His energy returns to him. He begins to see how many people depended on pulling him into their chaos to avoid facing their own. The ones who provoke him needed his anger to hide their insecurity. The ones who argue endlessly needed his responses to validate their importance. The ones who create drama needed his presence to fuel their narratives. But the Sigma no longer offers himself as an emotional resource for anyone unwilling to take responsibility for their own internal storms. His silence becomes a boundary. His calm becomes a shield. His refusal to react becomes an act of self-preservation and self-respect. When he stops entering these battles, the emotional landscape around him changes. Conflicts that once consumed hours now dissolve in minutes because he does not feed them. Drama that once followed him fades because he does not participate. Manipulators who used emotional intensity as a weapon lose access to their power source. He becomes unreachable to those who rely on emotional volatility to control others. And in that stillness, he feels something he had forgotten: peace. A peace that was always his, but one he kept sacrificing to save relationships that were not saving him in return. This reclaimed energy doesn't just restore him, it transforms him. With no arguments draining his mental clarity, he thinks deeply again. With no emotional traps stealing his time, he moves with purpose. With no guilt-driven reactions controlling his choices, he builds a life aligned with his values instead of someone else's chaos. His silence becomes his strength, not because he avoids emotion, but because he refuses to let emotion be used against him. By stepping out of emotional battles, he steps into sovereignty. He realizes that control isn't something you take from others. It's something you stop giving away. And when he protects his energy, he becomes the one thing none of his opponents ever expected: untouchable. People reveal their true intentions when he stops feeding the dynamic. A Sigma male understands that as long as he continues responding, explaining, defending, comforting, or engaging, people can hide behind the mask they present to him. His reactions give them cover. His responses allow them to maintain an illusion of sincerity, loyalty, or concern. But the moment he stops feeding the dynamic, when he withdraws his energy and goes silent, the truth emerges with stunning clarity. People who were once charming become distant. Those who acted supportive become irritated. Those who pretended to care grow cold. Those who relied on his emotional labor suddenly reveal the one thing they never wanted him to see. Their intentions were conditional, not genuine. His silence becomes a filter, a natural sorting mechanism that exposes what words once concealed. The people who valued the connection continue showing up. They ask, they check in, they adjust, they take responsibility. They don't need his reaction to stay consistent, but the ones who used him for attention, validation, control, or emotional stability begin to unravel. They become frustrated when he no longer responds on command. They escalate when he stops reacting to their provocations. They withdraw entirely when they realize they can no longer extract what they want from him. And each behavior reveals exactly why they were there in the first place. This is why his silence is more revealing than confrontation. When he stops participating in the emotional exchange, their patterns speak louder than anything they ever said. The manipulator grows restless. The selfish friend disappears. The narcissist becomes hostile. The dependent person becomes anxious. Their reactions paint a clear picture. They were invested in the dynamic, not in him. They needed his reactions to maintain their power, their comfort, or their ego. Without those reactions, they have nothing left to hold on to, and so their true colors bleed through the cracks. Meanwhile, the Sigma remains still, observing, understanding, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. He doesn't need to accuse anyone or seek explanations. Their behavior under silence is the explanation. And because he is no longer emotionally involved, he sees the truth with a calmness that once felt impossible. The people who stay steady are the ones who belong. The people who collapse under silence are the ones who were only there for themselves. By no longer feeding the dynamic, he forces reality to reveal itself. And once he sees someone's true intentions, he never forgets them. Because the strongest truth is always the one revealed, when he gives nothing for others to feed on. His calm detachment makes others overextend, exposing their weaknesses. A Sigma male knows that the moment he stops reacting, the balance of power shifts in a way most people never expect. His calm detachment doesn't escalate conflict, it dissolves the emotional tension that others depend on to feel in control. And that absence of reaction, that unshakable neutrality, forces people into a psychological corner. They begin to over-explain, over-justify, overreact, and overreach. Because they cannot read him. They don't know where he stands, what he's thinking, or what he plans to do next. That uncertainty creates pressure, not on him, but on them. And under pressure, people always reveal their weaknesses. He remains still while they become frantic. He stays emotionally centered while they scramble to regain control of the dynamic. They start asking too many questions, giving too many excuses, saying too much, or acting too aggressively. All because his calmness makes them feel exposed. They relied on his reactions to guide their behavior, to predict the outcome, to know how far they could push. But when he gives them nothing, they lose their sense of direction. They try harder, louder, faster, hoping to provoke a response that will tell them they still have some influence over him. And the more they push, the more transparent they become. His calm detachment functions like a psychological magnifying glass. The manipulator becomes desperate when manipulation stops working. The insecure person becomes defensive when validation collapses. The dominant one becomes unstable when they can no longer intimidate him. Their weaknesses spill out through their actions, not because he exposed them, but because they couldn't handle the silence that forced them to confront themselves. They hoped he would argue, explain, or react emotionally so they could regain leverage. Instead, he watches as their own behavior unravels before them. And then, as Earlythwaite, the dead breathe. What makes his calm so powerful is that it is intentional. He isn't numb, he isn't indifferent, he is strategic. He knows that reacting gives others access to his emotional world, and withholding reaction protects it. His stillness isn't passive, it's controlled. He chooses not to engage because he refuses to let someone else dictate the terms of his emotional state. And that refusal destabilizes anyone who hoped to use emotion as a weapon against him. By staying calm, the Sigma male reveals who is strong and who is fragile, who is sincere and who is manipulative, who is grounded and who is dependent. He doesn't need confrontation to expose weakness. He doesn't need arguments to reveal character. He simply stays silent, steady, detached, and everyone around him shows exactly who they are. By withdrawing emotionally, he resets the power balance entirely in his favor. A Sigma male knows that the true battlefield in any relationship, whether personal, social, or psychological, is emotional leverage. As long as someone has access to his emotions, they have access to his reactions, his decisions, and his internal world. But the moment he withdraws emotionally, everything resets. The power dynamic shifts instantly, quietly, and completely. Suddenly, the person who once controlled the rhythm of the interaction loses their grip. Their tactics fail, their influence dissolves, their confidence cracks. Because a Sigma's emotional withdrawal isn't avoidance, it's recalibration. It's him reclaiming his autonomy and removing the emotional currency others relied on to hold power over him. When he detaches, he breaks the unspoken agreement that his emotions will be available on demand. The arguments that once worked no longer move him. The guilt trips that once weakened him now fall flat. The manipulation that once confused him no longer finds a target. He rewrites the entire dynamic by refusing to fund it with his emotional engagement. And because emotional battles require two participants, the moment he steps out, the battle ends. Not in compromise, but in clarity. The other person must now face a version of him they cannot sway, distract, or destabilize. This emotional withdrawal doesn't come from coldness, it comes from understanding. He sees where the imbalance formed, who was taking more than giving, who was pushing more than listening, who was benefiting more than contributing. And instead of fighting to be heard or fighting to fix what isn't his to fix, he steps back. He lets silence dismantle what noise kept alive. Without his emotional investment, the dynamic cannot function the same way. The one who once held psychological control loses it simply because the Sigma no longer provides the emotional fuel that kept them powerful. As he pulls inward, something else happens. His clarity sharpens. He sees the situation for what it is, not what he hoped it could be. He sees the person for who they are, not who they pretended to be. He sees his own worth without the distortion of emotional exhaustion. This clarity strengthens him, and from that strength, He rebuilds the dynamic on his terms or walks away entirely, knowing the other person cannot pull him back into imbalance again. In the end, a Sigma male doesn't gain control by dominating others. He gains control by refusing to let anyone dominate him emotionally. His withdrawal is not an escape. It is a reset, a powerful, quiet rebalancing that places him exactly where he belongs, in full command of his energy, his boundaries, and his direction. When a Sigma male stops reacting, the entire dynamic shifts, not because he becomes colder, but because he becomes clearer. His silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. His detachment isn't distance, it's power. And anyone who once relied on his emotional availability suddenly realizes they never understood the strength he was holding back. That's the moment everything changes, quietly, permanently, and in his favor. If this breakdown resonated with you, tell me in the comments with one word, And here's the question for you. When was the moment you realized silence gave you more control than reaction?